Okay, this will begin segment 1 for Monday's class, and we'll pick up with our look at imperialism. You will recall that the United States becomes imperialistic. It's a change from their previous view towards foreign policy, and as we talked about, the foreign policy elite will have something to do with that, and the media will definitely bring forward the idea of the United States focusing on Cuba. And we discussed the whole scenario around the behavior of General Valeriano Weyler and the fact that the American media focused on him as a very evil figure. And we discussed the idea that adding to the anger towards Cuba and the fact that, the Spanish in Cuba, and the fact that the United States was not happy with their behavior was the notion that the killing that continually is described in American newspapers must be stopped. And you can add to that, of course, the United States' dislike of colonialism, which obviously came from our initial formation. And then you can add to that as well the impact of yellow journalism. Again, if the New York newspapers print something that's not correct or exaggerated, then all the other newspapers in the country will pick it up through the wire services. And the reason that those other papers don't have reporters in Cuba is that they can't afford it. They don't make the profit that the massive circulation of New York newspapers and, of course, the advertising revenue that comes from that allows the New York papers to have. So the New York media then, and even to an extent now, although it's changed slightly, has a huge impact on what our country thinks is important. Now, what we're going to move into now is that McKinley is elected in 1896 and inherits Cleveland's problem of dealing with Cuba, but he was elected on a platform of Cuba Libre. McKinley actually wanted to settle the conflict peacefully, but the foreign policy elite was primed for war. What followed when McKinley took office were a series of incidents which make war seem to almost be inevitable. And so let's take a look at the 3 steps that actually lead the United States to war. In some wars we've seen that there weren't any specific events that you could really focus on, but in the Spanish-American War, and of course World War I and World War II later, there will be definite events that are focused on as the cause of the United States deciding to enter into war. So what we're going to have are 3 different steps to war. The first one will be the Delome letter, which is published on February 10th, 1898. Now, this is a letter that is written from a Spaniard in Cuba, Spanish official in Cuba, to the Spanish minister in Washington, D.C. So it's the #1 Spanish diplomat in Washington, D.C. And it is intercepted by the Cuban rebels, who then give it to the Hearst newspapers, and the Hearst newspapers will print these some of the ideas in this letter in big bold letters in their papers. And the Delome letter, which was originally intended for Guy Dupuy Delome, who was the Spanish minister in Washington, in essence said that it was the Spanish viewpoint that McKinley really didn't want war, but that he was going to allow the media to push him into it. And it used terms that seemed to indicate that the Spanish believed that McKinley was weak and would not be able to hold off the impact that the media had upon him and his decision making. So in a sense it said McKinley's a wimp. And of course, when this was published in the Hearst newspapers, it caused great anger in the United States. If you had polled Americans at that point, since it took McKinley a long time to jump into this war, they probably would have agreed that McKinley was weak on foreign policy. But you don't call him that if you're from another nation. It's all right for us to say that about him, but when someone from another nation says our president is weak, then it causes quite a bit of anger. That was the first step, and of course, less than 1 week later, on February 15th, 1898, the event that most people like to focus on that starts the war is the explosion of the U.S. battleship Maine. It explodes when it's docked in Havana Harbor in Cuba, and when it explodes, 226 sailors are killed almost immediately, almost the entire crew. As we look on the next slide, you'll see some of the images of the Maine exploding. But as we go back, the question is, who's actually behind the explosion? Well, a lot of Americans believed very quickly that the Spanish, because they were unhappy with our view towards their actions in Cuba, had purposely sabotaged the ship, maybe put explosives on it, and in a sense had committed an act of terrorism that would lead the Americans to want to go to war. It's possible that it could have been an accident. The ships at the time ran on coal. Coal dust was very flammable. A lot of the sailors liked to smoke cigarettes, and it's very possible that that could have caused an accidental explosion. One interesting theory that a lot of people really didn't pay that much attention to at the time, but historians have focused on since then, was the idea that this may have been a plot by the Cuban rebels to anger the Americans enough to get them involved into the war. Now, the American media, however, had no question what had actually happened. And so as we move to the next slide, you see these are some of the responses of the American newspapers. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. The Spain is destroyed by treachery. They really didn't have any question in their minds who was behind it. And as a consequence, they pushed very firmly and very loudly for the United States to get into war. Interestingly, the actual reason for this explosion is not something that historians even agree upon today. There were recreations that were done in the 1970s, and if people were forced today to come up with a theory, it's actually that it was an accident. There's a lot of people today who believe it possibly was an accident, but whether it was or not, the impact of the explosion definitely pushes the United States towards going to war. As a little side note, there's a question of why is the USS Maine in Havana Harbor to begin with? We're having difficulty with the Spanish. The Maine is one of our brand new battleships. We had 7. The Maine explodes. We end up having 6. So why was it there? Well, McKinley had actually sent it there to do a little saber rattling to try and convince the Spaniards to step down from some of the things that they had been doing to the Cubans. So a lot of people tend to forget to ask that question as well. But again, it really doesn't make any difference. The American people were primed for war. Now, this third step that leads us to war is one that I always like to focus on, because occasionally it's good to be able to point out that people will actually stop and think before they make very important decisions in the history of the United States. And McKinley, at the time, even though the newspapers were screaming for vengeance and the pressure on him was mounting, decided that before he would make his decision, he would actually try to get a reasonable view of what was actually happening in Cuba instead of just relying on the newspapers. He sent a friend of his who was actually a Republican senator and was somebody who was at the time still against war, by the name of Redfield Proctor, to go to Cuba on a fact-finding mission, and in a sense go down there and find out what was really going on instead of just relying upon what the media was saying. Now, interestingly, Proctor goes to Cuba and actually comes back with his mind changed, and in fact he tells McKinley, I don't think that the Cubans will change their behavior unless we force them to do so. He also, as you can see in this picture, described very vividly to McKinley much of what was going on in Cuba with the camps and how something needed to be done to stop it. And so what will begin at that point is that on April 11th, McKinley will ask Congress for war. On April 19th, Congress votes to go to war, and it's officially declared on April 25th, 1898. So it's a war between the United States and Spain, and as you can see there in red bold letters, it's for the recognition of the independence of the people of Cuba, demanding that the government of Spain relinquish its authority and government in the island, or on the island, and withdraw its land and naval forces. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that connected to this declaration of war was an important amendment called the Teller Amendment, named after the senator who put it on there. And this amendment actually said that the United States pledged not to turn Cuba into a colony after this war was over. So we were making the stand that we were going to fight for right and moralistic values. Of course, it didn't say anything about any of the Spaniards' other holdings, which of course is going to be a big issue as we move forward. And what begins at that point is the 10-week, as one person described it later, splendid little war. So the question we have here now is exactly what does the United States want? Technically, by declaring war on Spain, I guess we could try to invade Spain itself. Spain could try to invade any part of the United States. One of the big questions initially was, what would the rest of Europe say? Because Spain is, or at least it once was, a major power in Europe. What would the French and British say? Well, in a sense, when asked by the United States government, the British and French responded that they'd be happy if we knocked the Spanish off and kind of wished us good luck. So they were going to stay on the sidelines and not get involved. And as I said before, a question would be, would the Spanish try to invade the United States? Well, there was a strong sense of United States moral righteousness here, a sense that we were this growing and powerful nation and that we were taking on a nation that probably couldn't keep up with us. And so to show you the attitude that people had at the beginning of the war, one New York newspaper commented that if the Spanish tried to invade New York City, they'd just be absorbed into the population. So this is a very positive sense that many Americans had as the war began. The war itself started in April and ended in August of 1898. It's probably one of the shortest wars we've ever had, and in fact, in many ways, one of the most successful. Of course, it was extravagantly reported by the press, although the New York newspapers led the way. And as we'll see, the fact that New York papers were involved in a lot of the reporting will be one of the reasons that they will focus specifically on one soldier more than any other, and he happened to be a guy who was from New York City. In this war, the United States will lose only 385 men. The Spanish will lose quite a few more than that. As the war began, when you take a look at the two sides, and this is what the term balance sheet usually relates to in military history, the only advantage that Spain had was at the beginning of the war, they had many more men under arms. They had almost 200,000 troops in Cuba at this point. They had removed some that had been there before. They had almost 400,000 under arms in Spain itself. And at the time, the United States had a very small army that was really only doing occupation duty and watching the Indians out in the west. So the United States is going to have to put its army together pretty quickly. Otherwise, the United States had every advantage. Production of its own weapons, vastly superior navy, as you can see here. This is going to be a sea war, or the Navy will have a large impact. And at the time, the U.S. was the sixth largest Navy in the world. First class and cutting-edge technology was part of what American ships were all about. The Spanish, due to their lack of income and modernization of their forces, had only one second-class battleship, and many of their other ships, some of their other ships were even made of wood. One of the things this is going to lead to is that the United States has a true dominance on the seas, and this will have a huge impact on the way the war is actually fought. So the war will actually begin not in Cuba itself, but in an ironic twist far across the globe in the Philippines. Now, the Spaniards had a squadron that was based in Manila Bay in the Philippines. And interestingly, the Battle of Manila Bay will occur on May 1st, 1898. Now, this is very important because the reason that the Americans will actually take off from Hong Kong, as you see here in this map, and it will be Admiral Dewey who will lead the American squadron to take on the Spaniards. The reason that they will leave Hong Kong when they do is that Teddy Roosevelt, who at the time was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, in a sense took advantage of the fact that his boss was away from the office when the war was beginning to build up, and on his own ordered that American squadron to go ahead and make way as quickly as they possibly could to the Philippines. And it's because he ordered them very early that they got there in time to actually be able to bottle up the Spanish squadron before it could get out of Manila Bay. Now, the fact that he did this could have possibly led to war before it was actually declared, but it ended up being perfect timing, and the American Navy ended up defeating the Spaniards handily in the Battle of Manila Bay, which we will pick up with in the next segment.